You know, it's really crazy because when I first stopped creating from a place of chaos, I thought that my creative journey was over and I couldn't see any other way out, really. I couldn't see how to progress, how to get better, how to become a better artist. And I thought I might lose my edge, whatever edge I did have when I was drinking and using drugs all the time, you know. I was really disheartened about the fact that this chaotic energy that I used to use every now and then as an artist, fueled by booze and drugs and partying, whatever it was gone, you know. And what I came to realise actually is that I found something deeper and steadier in this new way of working, in this new life, you know, this new sober life, in recovery, away from drink and drugs. And that's what I want to talk about today. It's purpose. You know, there's such a massive difference between chaos and purpose. We need a bit of both. And unfortunately, when we are in active addiction, we're much more chaotic than we are purposeful. And in my experience, the only purpose I had really was to go out and get drunk and party and do whatever I wanted to do. And when I came into recovery, you know, the creative purpose took on a totally different angle. You know, in my drinking days, or even when life was just a bit more chaotic, creativity was much more about adrenaline. It was about the highs, you know, it was about reaching these totally crazy places, whether it was at parties or even on my own in my room when I used to drink and do drugs and try and paint, you know, and draw and be an artist. Never really worked, by the way. You know, I was always trying to chase something, which is very typical, isn't it, when we're in addiction, chasing like this next high or chasing this, you know, state of mind where I was able to be extremely creative. But the problem with that is that it's not sustainable, you know, and it really relies on a drug and drink induced state, which is just by its own definition not very healthy, in my opinion. You know, and that urgency that I felt when I was in those states, it felt like an energy, you know, but the issue with that kind of energy is that it doesn't come from within us, it comes from outside of us. And without the drink and drugs, I found that I wasn't able to sit with myself, to spend time in front of a canvas or writing or being in that creative mindset. And that was a massive problem for me because, you know, I've always wanted to be an artist and I never really understood how, in fact, that I could become an artist without drink and drugs. You know, it burned me out, that's the truth of it. And I know a lot of other people get burnt out trying to chase this sort of dream of becoming a creative person and also chasing the lifestyle that is very often attached to the creative circles. And, you know, burnout is a real massive problem. You know, when I finally made that decision and the chaos stopped, it did leave a gap, that's the truth. And it's important to acknowledge that there is a gap when we make that plunge and decide to live a life without drink and drugs. You know, I didn't know how to fill it at first, and it took me a long time to figure things out, slowly, painfully, you know. I really had to reinvent myself, and it's important for me to share these things because I know that is other people's experience as well. Other creatives who are new to recovery or want to be in recovery inevitably will have to go through this kind of remolding phase. So there's a bit of a shift that happened really, you know, and I started to think about the difference between chaos and purpose. And chaos for me is very reactive. It's reactive, and you know, I would always react to the state I was in. I would get myself into certain states using drink and drugs, and then I would react to those. You know, I would have mental health crisis, and I would react to those. You know, and for me now, purpose is very intentional. I have a sort of purpose to my life now, being in recovery, and it's really important for me to hammer home the fact that it takes time to find this purpose, but we're going to start to get into that in this video, and I'm going to go into how you can start to generate some ideas about what your purpose is and how to live a more intentional and creatively prosperous life as someone who struggles with drink and drugs. Chaos really makes you depend on mood, on circumstances, and again, the one point I want to hammer home today is that this chaotic lifestyle, we are drawing our energy from outside of ourselves. And now in recovery, when I'm living a more intentional and purposeful lifestyle, I'm drawing energy from within myself, you know, and it is, in a sense, coming from somewhere outside of me, but it's kind of channeled through me, and I've found it to be much more sustainable, much more pleasant place to be, honestly. Far less chaotic, as is the point of this video. You know, we're trying to get away from that chaos, but use it intentionally and use it productively in our own creative works, whatever they may be. You know, purpose is slower, but it leads to a deeper, more meaningful work, whatever that might be. Chaos gave me a sense of speed, purpose gave me depth, you know, and I think that's a really important distinction to make. Now, the deepness that I have, this connection to something that is a very deep creative practice, is really, really important. And the good thing about deepness and depth in our creative work is that it lasts for a long time, you know. And if we start to build things down and up as well at the same time, instead of just lightly dusting them across, you know, in this chaotic way, then it gives us more to go off. It gives us a deeper sense of self and of who we really are as creatives. And it's a much more productive and beautiful place to be, I'll tell you that much. So a few tangible steps that I think that anyone at the beginning of this journey can take to get perhaps a bit more clarity, to bring a bit more intention into their life, and to start to think more productively about what they want to do as a creative person, is to start with why we are doing this in the first place. It's a really important question, and it's one that I think that everybody should sit with seriously for as much time as you need. You know, you really need to write down why you create. You need to write down what it is you will be doing outside of deadlines, outside of, money, and outside of ourselves, really. We need to find that sort of big guiding light that will keep us going when we're not motivated, when we're struggling in our recovery, when things perhaps aren't going our way. Having a really powerful why at the center of our existence is really, really crucial, because it's a much more sustainable source of energy than anything else I have found, you know, and that includes drink and drugs. Drink and drugs for me are like some kind of firework that you just set off and then they're done in a couple of seconds, where if we find this purpose, this sense of our why, it's like a lovely campfire that burns all night that we can sit around and chat with our friends, you know, and it keeps us warm for a long time. So yeah, find your why, or at least start to think about it, make some notes, sit down quietly, no distractions, make a nice cup of tea or coffee or a cold drink if you're living in a really hot country, wherever you may be, and just spend some time really digging into like what your why is, you know. Number 2 on this list of 3 little things that I've got here, you know, we need to pick a rhythm over a rush. And what I mean by that is we need to start getting into some kind of rhythm that follows a weekly or a daily or a monthly trend. And of course, everyone's rhythm is going to be different, depending on your circumstances. Maybe you've got a job, maybe you've got a family, maybe you've got other commitments outside of your own creative practice. But if you are someone who is in recovery or new to recovery or sober curious or curious about living without drink and drugs at the center of your life, then rhythm is really important. And so that for me is like having a daily or weekly schedule or some kind of practice that we can get into very easily. And so for me, when I was first in recovery, just to give a little bit of a story, is like I found it very hard to get into routine at the beginning of my recovery, you know, and there was a lot of things going on. My head was all over the place. But the thing that kept me going was just having this little moment every day where I would write something down, or I would draw something or doodle something. Or if I was at a cafe, I'd just sketch like one of the little, I don't know, plants on the table, or one of the other people in the cafe, for example. So think about your own creative practice and how, like what we want is like the minimum barrier to entry, something that we can do every day, even when we're finding things hard, even when life's throwing things at us, we can still keep going and still find a little bit of solace in the chaos, you know, of life. Number 3, this is probably the most important one, and this is something now that I'm still working on, and I have been in recovery for 5.5-ish years at this time of recording, and that is to separate our making from judgment. So to start with, I want to say that thinking and making are two separate processes, and it's important for us to keep them pretty separate. If we are trying to think about our next moves and make them at the same time, whether that's on a painting or a piece of music or writing, then it very easily gets confused. And you know what I do with my painting is I like to sit and look at it and think about it, and then I go and I do, and then I come back and I sit and I think about it, and then I go and do. And it's this kind of regimented process. And so to separate making from judgment is really, really important, because what we do is we get into that creative state first, and then when we're out of that heightened creative state, we can reflect, we can critique, whilst being nice to ourselves, which I'm also really guilty of not doing, and then we don't want to derail our purpose by our perfectionism. And this is something I've talked about before, and it's something I'll continue to talk about. Perfectionism is something that I really struggle with, and it gives me so much anxiety that it stops me from making sometimes, and it's a really important lesson for me to share, is that the making needs to just happen, and then we can think about it afterwards, So these are the three things, like find a why in our lives. What is it that we're really wanting to do with our time now that we're perhaps in recovery or curious about it? 2 is pick a rhythm over this like rush and chaos of addiction. So find a bit of time every morning, or every Sunday evening before you get back to work if you're extremely busy, and set aside an hour to do some writing, some reading, some guitar, drawing, whatever your creative practice is, dancing. And then number 3 would be to separate the making from the judging. So remember that thinking and making are 2 different things, and we need to create first, critique later. Purpose should not be derailed by perfectionism. So yeah, I'm going to close up now. I hope you've got something from that, Chaos for me can feel really thrilling, but it is a short-term game. Purpose is what allows us to keep showing up year after year, and I can say that it's been the case in my own experience, and and start making work that really matters to us. And then, moving forwards, I'm going to really dive into a lot of these practical tips that have really helped me in early, mid and current recovery. And to be honest, these tips are still relevant to me now, and it's like it never really ends. It's just this cycle that keeps getting tighter and more condensed and more realized. And so I'm really on this journey at the same time as you, and these videos are really helpful for me to remind myself of why I'm doing what I'm doing. So thank you for listening. Leave a comment, please, give it a like, subscribe. And if you like what you see, let me know. And if you don't like what you see, also open to criticism. I'm really trying to help people here and provide value. And for me to know how to do that, I need to get some feedback. So appreciate you all. Thank you very much.